So I don't have slides, and I will propose an idea for JATS 1.5 or 2.0. Nothing that you have to worry about in the next 2 weeks, but maybe after I talk, you either say that's totally stupid or you start thinking. And the idea is to turn JATS into a container format, which basically means a standard of zipping a folder and some sort of basic rules of how you zip things, what kind of files you have in the folder. And if you think that sounds familiar, then of course you're right. Best example is epub, of course. But it's also a very common approach to XML files. So just take docx as an example. It's of course zipped files which have a standard structure. There are a number of standards how you could do this. And the sort of most likely starting point is something called Universal Container Format, which is an Adobe proposed standard, which is sort of came out of the epub work, which is much more about this container, not so much about the specifics of epub as a format. The benefits I see with this proposal, so that JATS is actually not an XML file, but a zip file that contains what we currently have as JATS, is, well, the slight benefit might be the compression, that a zip file is, of course, easier to transport over networks. But more importantly, it solves a problem that might be small for some organization, but big for others, which is the assets associated with an article, meaning figures, supplementary information, other things, where sometimes you link to them, but sometimes you just want to include them. You can, of course, put random things in a container, which could be different versions, different representations. So if you want to, you could have, well, different steps of the life cycle of a manuscript. And in general, the idea is that the JATS becomes a container that you can ship around in workflows that go beyond your own systems and is rather something, well, as a file format that can also travel maybe from an author to a publisher and then somewhere else and back, etc., which is really difficult right now if you have an XML file that references many other things that might live in other places. The risks, of course, are twofold. Number one is, of course, its work, and nobody likes that. And number two, it might be going a direction that is in many ways obvious, but might just be a direction that JATS is not willing to take at this point. Thank you.
Question? Comment?
Hi, I have a question. Caroline Weber from Aries Systems, and we actually do ship around from our system a zip file that includes JATS XML and source files, but one thing that I brought up in prior years is that inside the JATS XML, there's no real file manifest, and I've been told in prior years we don't want to add a file manifest to JATS, but I think it would be helpful. So my question for you, Martin, is if the files are in the zip, is there any reference to those files within the JATS, or are you just thinking that they would just kind of sit there and the JATS XML would be also in the zip, but not really reference the files that were there with it?
So to the first part, what you said, I think that's my basic idea. That, I mean, it's a perfect example that if you do that, what you're already doing, it would be nice if you had a standard way and if you would send files around sort of many to many, that not everybody has its own slightly different implementation. I think one of the standards of these container formats is that there's a manifest file which says what are the files in there, and there's also some other things. I would imagine that it would be advisable that the JATS file within there is probably should look too different from what we have now. I would think that the manifest creates some duplication, but that's sort of to work on.
So would you be suggesting that we come up with a standard for the manifest file? Because we do have a manifest file that goes along with ours, but it's kind of one we just kind of made up and some people don't like it.
If you think about what would be the sort of the minimal agreement or standardization you would have to do, if you take universal container format as a starting point, I mean that basically tells you things like how you should zip things so that everybody can open this. And there is something about manifest files, and I think if you start with that, I wouldn't think it would be too much of an effort to come up with something that's usable. It looks maybe looks 95% similar to what you're doing now.
Sorry, Evan Owens. A couple of things. If we're going to do the manifest and all of that, we certainly want a standard for referencing the files from within JATS. I mean, that is something that epub does. At Portico, having processed millions of articles from a zillion publishers, that the rules for how publishers referenced or didn't reference the file names and so on, we had to build a rules engine that we could configure for every single publisher to match the graphics with the text. And it would be wonderful to have a standard for that, for the community.
John Meyer with Portico. Just wondering, why couldn't you just use epub as your standard, converting the JATS into the XHTML to support the epub, but you'd also have the JATS file in there, you'd have all the references, it's already a standard. If you don't want to go that far, you could also use Bagot spec from Library of Congress, which is a standard transmission package with file references and a manifest. Doesn't resolve what Evan was pointing to, which is the actual file references from the JATS files to the images themselves, but it is a manifest file.
Well, I guess my proposal is to come up with a solution of a container, which is totally separate from epub. I mean, there's no direct connection, only that they're doing this for many years. And that's the idea, to have a more generic format. And of course, you could look at different things out there that exist and see what is the best fit. But I don't see having something that's also epub. That's a wholly different story, and maybe that's too much in one thing, for my personal view.
Debbie LePere. I think this is a wonderful idea, but this isn't JATS. What this has to do with JATS is that whatever you come up with has JATS inside it. And what you need is a group to work on what is this container, you know, as Carolyn said, does it have a manifest? What does the manifest look like? What are the limits of the container? I think that would be fabulous work. That group would probably make recommendations to JATS going, by the way, this is going to work a whole lot better if you resolve your file names in the following fashion. I think that's fabulous work, but it's up here, and JATS is here, sitting inside it.
I also find this idea very intriguing. One thing I think we all need to think about as we explore it is what the relationship is between a JATS document and its nominal DTD or schema or schemas. As we know, there are several of them. There are also more of them out there, and the DTD parsing does affect the model that the processor encounters. This is something that is sometimes a problem. In fact, it came up yesterday in the stuff that Chris was showing us in the Saxon CE distribution, where we have DTD-related glitches. And so one thing I think is really intriguing about your idea is that it sort of moves us forward in thinking about the boundaries around what constitutes a JATS document. Images that go with that JATS document may belong inside the boundary lines. Do DTDs belong inside those boundary lines? I don't really know.
Tommy Esden, I think you're actually asking for two things. I think you're asking for there to be a packaging format that will hold all of these things, and for somebody to associate one with JATS. I don't think you need a separate packaging format for JATS documents than for a bunch of other documents. Do you think it would meet your need if the JATS folks somehow, and I don't quite know how, and I don't know that it's really a JATS standing committee sort of thing, but if somehow there were a JATS community that said, we suggest this packaging format, does it have to be something new, or is it okay if it's just an endorsement of an existing packaging format?
Well, I think the idea of having a standard file format, particularly in this case where you maybe just send files to random people, I think there should be an expectation how to handle that. So there has to be some standard way of doing that, because otherwise the benefits are not one. If, like the areas use case, if somebody else does something very similar but not quite the same, then you already are losing the benefits of such a system.
Okay.
I'm stealing this because I'm jumping in line with questions. MC's privilege. So what I wanted to say is that the NISO does have a group that's working on a packaging recommended practice. I wish Kim Trico was still here. She and Laurie Kaplan are heading the group and wrangling us. But it's PESC, and it's a packaging standard. So it discusses multiple things that have been brought up here, like the Bagot standard and a standard packaging format, or standard language for manifests, referencing files using JATS metadata and other defined vocabularies to define the metadata that goes along with the package. So that might be something to look into. It's undergone the first public comment period and has the committee still responding to those, I believe.
And Kim should be back by break.
Excellent. Okay, let's take one more. We have Evan again. Okay.
Yeah. So that was actually what I was going to mention, was PESC. And having read that thing, the problem is that it's a recommended practice and not a standard, and it will never meet the needs of the community properly because it is not an actionable standard. At least the first draft was very inadequate. I hope that it will kick it up several notches in the next draft, but it is not a standard of the sort that we would need to actually work. It was a broad recommended practice, which was not fully actionable.
All right, well, thank you for the lively discussion. We have more to talk about at coffee break.